Sometimes when we deploy Pulumi stacks, it can be useful to extract certain values from the deployed stack, possibly because we want to inspect them manually, or perhaps because another program is going to then use those values, perhaps a different part of our CI pipeline, or possibly because we want to use those values in other Pulumi stacks. And so in this video, I'm going to demonstrate how Pulumi allows us to do that with its concept of stack outputs. If you've watched the other videos in this series so far, you'll have already seen me use stack outputs because there's always one present in the default TypeScript program that I've been starting from. So you may have seen me refer to these already, but in this video, I'm going to talk about them in more detail. The example stack I'm going to use for this demonstration is the same as the last video, which is where I'm trying to create a Cognito user pool and also a user pool client. As before, don't worry if you don't really know anything about Cognito. I'm really just using it to illustrate concepts that apply to any Pulumi resources. So one of the typical things that's useful to know about a user pool that you've deployed through Pulumi is what its user pool ID is. At the very least, it's good to know what it is because that's how it's going to appear in the AWS console. So it would make sense to add the user pool ID as a stack output. To register the user pool ID as an output, I can make use of TypeScript's export syntax in just the same way that I would do normally in TypeScript when I want to make a value available to other files. So for example, export const user pool ID equals . And just for clarity, let's add another one. Let's also export the client ID as well, because that's also something that's often useful to know. To register these new outputs, I need to deploy my stack. So I'll run Pulumi up. And you'll see that the CLI summarizes the outputs and their values. I want to quickly mention that the syntax we used for registering the outputs varies massively depending on which language you're using. So to check the syntax for your language, you want to go to the stacks page on Architecture and Concepts, go down to Stack Outputs, and there you'll see that's the TypeScript syntax that we used, and you can see that it's quite different for Python, and for C# it varies quite a bit. So we now know how to register the outputs and to see the outputs when we deploy the stack, but what about seeing the outputs for a stack that has already been deployed? Well, it's probably not surprising to learn that you can see that in the Pulumi web interface. So if I go to Projects and then click on my stack, I can see my two outputs here. So that can be really useful for just checking certain resource IDs or certain configuration that you've registered there for stacks that are already in existence. And you can also do it through the CLI. And you do that with Pulumi stack output. By default, this will show you all the outputs, but you can just show a single output by providing the name of the output on the CLI. And you can see that in this case, you don't get any extra stuff around it. You just get the plain value printed out to standard out, which can be particularly useful if another program is trying to parse the client ID. There is this warning as well, of course, but I think this will be coming out to the standard error output. So if you try to parse the output of this command with a bash script or something, then you should just get this plain value. So that can be really useful, as I say, as part of like an automation pipeline, a CI pipeline or something. And another thing that's useful to know is you can force this to be JSON output as well, which again can be really useful if you're actually trying to read these values from some other program. A couple of videos ago, I talked about the concept of secrets in Pulumi. And this is another situation where secrets come into play. Let's see what happens if I try to export something which is secret. So as an example, I happen to know that Cognito user pool clients have a client secret output. And as you can imagine, that is a secret. It's the way that a client, such as a mobile app, identifies itself to Cognito, so it has to be kept secret. If I register that export and then deploy my stack, then you'll notice that the CLI output obscures the actual value and just puts secret instead. Obviously, this is a really good thing because secrets could include things like admin passwords, things that you really want to keep as secret as possible. But for situations where you do genuinely want to show the values of some secret, then you can do that on the command line by adding the --show -secrets option. And well, it turns out my client secret was empty in this case, but nonetheless, it hasn't tried to obscure it this time. One slightly annoying thing is that as far as I'm aware, it's not possible to see the values of these secrets through the web interface. You can see that they're there, and it tells you quite rightly that it's encrypted, but I'm not aware of a way to actually view it on the web. So we've seen how to register outputs, and we've seen how they can be inspected manually, and perhaps even be used by other programs for automation. But one final thing they can be useful for is for sharing values between different stacks. The use of multiple stacks is a topic in itself, and actually there is some really great Pulumi documentation that's worth reading about the pros and cons of architecting your system either as one single stack that has perhaps lots of different components inside it, or maybe as multiple different stacks that can be deployed separately. It's kind of related to some of the arguments related to microservices versus monoliths and so on. So I won't go into those pros and cons here, but I do want to show you how you can import values from one stack into another. And it's quite simple. I'm going to keep this stack that I already have, and this one you can see that I've already named it stack 1. But I also have this second stack called stack 2, and currently all this does is deploy an S3 bucket. I'm going to go with a similar, slightly contrived example that I used in the previous video, which is say that in this situation, for whatever reason, I want the name of my S3 bucket to contain the name of the Cognito user pool. And because I don't necessarily decide that name, but it possibly comes from elsewhere, either from AWS or from some other configuration, I don't want to hard code it. I want to somehow pass it from one stack to another. And you can do that like this. You construct an instance of the pulumi.stackReference object, and into the constructor you pass the fully qualified stack name. I mentioned fully qualified stack names in the video on stacks, so if you're not familiar with that, you can check the Pulumi documentation or watch that video. But essentially what that means is it needs to be the name of my organization or my account, which is CloudSpeak, then the full name of the stack that I'm importing. And we can check this, by the way, from the pulumi.yaml file. That's what this name here is. So I'll copy that in. And then finally the actual stack name, which in this case is dev. I can then get the stack outputs from this stack reference with just the get output method. So in here, I just pass the name of one of my outputs. So going back to my first stack, for example, any of these will be fine. So let's, I'm going to use client ID. I think I said user pool name earlier, so sorry, I'm changing my mind, but the idea is the same. So let's just look at what that gives me. That, unsurprisingly, is going to give me a Pulumi output instance. In this case, the type system doesn't know what the type is, doesn't necessarily know it's going to be a string. But so let's call that client ID. And so now I'm going to give the bucket a name. And I'm going to use the interpolate method. You can refer back to a previous video if you're not sure about that, where it explains how the interpolate method works. So I'm just going to call it something like this. Pass in the client ID. So hopefully it doesn't matter too much what this example is. The point is that in our first project, in the stack for our first project, we exported this value client ID. And then in our second project, we are then trying to use that value, and we're doing it by way of a stack reference. And so that's how we can refer to output values that came from another project. And we're going to see evidence of it being used because the client ID is going to appear in the bucket name. So to check that that's the case, I need to change into my other project and run Pulumi up. And we can see from the outputs that that's worked because the bucket name contains the prefix that I gave it, followed by the client ID. And a reminder again that this client ID doesn't come from this stack, it comes from another stack.